I'm honored to partner with a dear friend and future co-conspirator, Bob Johansen. I think we're in for a really special treat, and we hope this is the beginning of an ongoing journey. I wanted to just give a little bit of background on Cinterfuse before we start the session, and just to kind of set the stage for Bob. And in looking at the attendee list, I think some of you are less familiar with us. But at the heart of what we are trying to do is that we are trying to build a disruptive tech-based innovation economy in greater Cincinnati. And our ambition is to be the top startup hub in the Midwest and the top innovation hub in the nation. And we're focusing on a few areas where we believe we have a very unique right to win. A big one is around supply chain logistics, an area that I think has really come to life recently with the Amazon hub here. We're now the #1 e-commerce distribution hub in the country. Big focus on the future of branding and retail, fin, insurtech, and connected health. And we have 3 building blocks of our model. We have a syndicate fund where we invest in the top venture capital firms in the country, about $120 million of invested capital. We have a bit of a storefront for startups who walk through the door. We're eager to help them in any way we can. And we have services for large enterprises that are looking to think and act like a startup. A really good example of the Cinterfuse mindset is taking place as we speak today over at Union Hall, which is technically empty of people. It is working overtime. We set up in a matter of days a PPE factory where we have first 50, now we're adding another 30, maybe 100 3D printers where we're producing protective masks for a range of stakeholders, hospitals, police departments. We just sent some to some Amazon delivery drivers. But, kind of think and act like a startup. We bootstrapped it. We leverage open source, 3D designs, and we converge, big company, startup, civic interest into this exercise. And this is kind of an ongoing, but I think this is kind of I was trying to think of a good example that kind of brings Cinterfuse in full picture. We also have, I won't say a lot about this, but just know that whether you're a startup or a large company, we're providing services to help you accelerate, step change, unlock value. And we have a number of services. There's a few examples of engagements we've been involved in recently, from P&G and game mechanics to matching up startups with Fidelity to working with FinTech, Fifth Third and Western and Southern and other kind of financial players here. But, we're very, very eager to help everybody accelerate. We believe that if we even help the big companies, that will lead to startup growth. We have fantastic programming. I couldn't be prouder of the lineup, and we have one of the best boards on the planet. And so, for example, our board chair is who actually happens to be the treasurer of a small mom and pop shop called P&G, and she's going to lead a session on managing cash flow in times of crisis. And we're going to have a lot more of this. So we hope you tune in. Some of you may want to contribute, but again, we're eager to help you grow in every way we can. This is our strategy for building a world-class innovation economy. So that's the backdrop on Cinterfuse. Let me now introduce Bob. I have been kind of a groupie of Bob Johansen all the way back to my P&G days when I had helped co-found the first interactive marketing team. He is one of the best thinkers on the planet, and he always kind of grounds it to an action plan. And my most recent engagement with him was when I was leading digital and then digital innovation at Nestle. I brought him to the executive suite, and he just had a huge impact on our thinking about the future of food, the future of figuring out how to win with millennials. He catalyzed us creating a whole Silicon Valley innovation outpost and many, many things, some things that have yet to be launched, but were impacted by his thinking. And so we wanted to bring some of the best of his latest thinking. And one of the things that's really unique about today is that Bob has a book that's just launched. And so you're going to get, you'll hear some of the themes that he's been talking about for a while, but he's really kind of taken it to a new level. We are going to give a bunch of books out to some of you. We put together a survey to gather as much feedback as we can about what worked, what didn't, and some of the future events we can have. If you fill out the survey, we'll put you in a drawing, and hopefully we'll get you a copy of Bob's book. We'll also highlight a discount code at the end of the session. So without further ado, let me hand over the slides to our guest of honor. I'll do a little bit of moderation on the side, and we'll be taking questions as they come through the webinar pipeline. But Bob, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much, Pete, and welcome everyone. I'd like to have this be as informal as we can, and it's kind of interesting. I do a lot of Zoom meetings nowadays, and I'm inviting you into my study here. I've got my books, my exercise equipment, and my golden retriever sitting on the left side here. So I'm very at home, and I'm actually a lot smarter when I'm in my study than I am when I'm on the road. So I hope we can have an informal conversation. I'll talk about the new book, but I'm going to focus on oh, there you see Atticus just stood up when I mentioned his name. So what I'm going to be doing is introducing some of the key ideas about what it takes to lead in this kind of post-outbreak world. We're not quite done with it, obviously. It's a global tragedy right now, but eventually we're going to be out of this. And the question is, what kind of leaders will thrive and what kind of leadership will be most useful? So I'm going to share a few slides, not very many, and then we'll be popping back into this more interactive mode. So here's the three books that constitute a trilogy that I've just finished. The new one's called Full Spectrum Thinking. I know a number of you in the webinar here have read the previous two, and this all began with the kind of frame of reference from the Institute. We're an independent nonprofit. We were a spinoff of RAND in 1968. Our mantra is combating short-termism and trying to think more strategically, imaginatively, trying to build more resilient organizations. We focus 10 years ahead, so we're not experts in the present, but we've gotten very good over the last 50 years at anticipating where things are going. So we actually keep track. One of the first questions you should always ask a futurist is, have you outlived your forecasts? And we have 5 times over. We're usually right. We keep track, and 60 to 80% of our forecasted futures over a 50-year period have actually happened. But it turns out that's not how you evaluate a futurist. That's how you evaluate a fortune teller. The way you evaluate a futurist is, does the foresight provoke your insight? Doesn't really matter if you agree with the foresight or not, but provoke your insight that leads to action. So this is the VUCA world frame that we're working from today, and it's just obvious now. I learned about it the week before 9/11 when I had my first visit to the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And this is a photograph that was given to me by the commandant at the time, Bob Ivany. These are special forces officers riding in Afghanistan right after 9/11. This was made into a popular movie. It was one of the few successful missions right at that time. And I'm convinced that this is a very good way to think about not only where we are now, but where we're going. And if you forecast this, my forecast is the next decade will be increasingly VUCA. I've been doing 10-year forecasting for more than 30 years. This is the most frightening 10-year forecast I've ever done. And it's the most hopeful. And I've been saying that for the last 10 years. So the VUCA world is what we all need to assume We're all in this massive scramble. And it's really obvious to everyone now, but it was quite obvious even 10 years ago. And those companies, those people who prepared for that, who expected that, who were ready for that, are much more able to win in this kind of world. So I now teach at the Army War College. I get the new 3-star generals on their first week in Washington. I get them 5 at a time. They read my books. We talk about strategy and leadership. And here's how I flip the VUCA world. What I say is, it's true, there's this negative side, but there's also a positive side, and volatility yields to vision. So vision gets rewarded disproportionately in these highly uncertain times. Uncertainty yields to understanding. Complexity yields to clarity. And this is what I want to talk about today, clarity, the importance of clarity. So the military says you want to be very clear where you're going, very flexible how you get there. And finally, ambiguity yields to agility. So here's one of the core forecasts in my current book, and it's something I build on in the new book. The future will reward clarity, but punish certainty. And you can see that all around us now. Many are certain, but few are clear. So just ask yourself, as you hear the news about COVID and response to COVID, be careful of certainty. There is no certainty in this world, but we all need clarity. So let me just break that down for you, and then we'll open the conversation with Pete again. Stories will help you develop your clarity and moderate your certainty. So clarity is expressed in stories, but certainty is expressed in rules or absolutes. Be very careful of anyone who uses the word absolutely very often. Absolutely is not a good word for the current situation. Almost nothing is absolute. That's interesting. So PowerPoint has frozen on me. So it is a VUCA world, so we need to be flexible when this happens. I try to have my PowerPoint fail me at least once during every presentation. Let's try this. Okay, good. Clarity includes questions. Certainty is about answers. Clarity includes stories that show curiosity and courage about other points of view. Certainty has little curiosity. Clarity includes self-effacing stories about what you don't know. What you need in this kind of period is strength and humility. Beware of people who have strength but no humility. Certainty doesn't care what it doesn't know, and it doesn't really want to know about it. Aaron Sorkin, the great playwright, the way he says the essence of a story, he says, I worship at the altar of intention and obstacle. So when you're thinking about what story you can tell, every great story has intention, that's clarity, but obstacles, that's the VUCA world. So let's do the pause to digest here. And Pete, let's go back to you. So it's clarity versus certainty. In the VUCA world, you want clarity, but be very careful of certainty.
So we have our lines open for questions, and in one of the questions, Bob, just any specific examples of companies that you think have done this particularly well in terms of that managing that kind of the tension you described?
Yeah. So, well, Amazon, you mentioned him earlier. Jeff Bezos has a line very much like this that he reprints in most of the annual reports, that he's very committed and very inflexible about objectives. That's clarity. But he's very flexible about execution. So in the military, this is called commander's intent or mission command, or the latest term, which I like the most, is flexive command. And what it means is you want to be very clear where you're going, very flexible how you get there, and using situation analysis and after action reviews, you continuously reassess who's in the best position to make which decision at what time.
And can you just say a word about, there's a lot of media attention about clarity and whether, all the right information is kind of getting out, but obviously it's such a moving target and it's hard to know, who to blame, who not, and can you kind of bring this closer to home in the context of the, what's happening with the COVID-19 crisis in terms of the way messaging is conveyed outside without perfect information?
Yeah, sure. So we have a project underway at the Institute now, which you can get updates on our website, and we're going to be releasing the first public versions of this post-COVID-19 scenarios. And Maria, our executive director, has been leading this effort, and it's all about trying to figure out more of a future where we're going. And just, when we do a 10-year forecast, we always go at least 50 years back. And the first thing you realize about the COVID crisis is this isn't a new concept. The notion of a global pandemic that's very much like this, that's been there for a long time. If you look back at Bill Gates's forecast, they were very accurate. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had great clarity about what needed to be done. It's just we didn't do it. We didn't do it globally. Really nobody did it well. So we need to learn from that lesson. Then, and I'm going to talk about this a little later in the seminar, we need that future back perspective. Where is it that we're going? Clearly, we're going to get through this one way or another. So this is the chance to restart and reset. So we have this response node now during the crisis. We'll be moving soon into a reset period, and that's when we have the opportunity to actually make things better. And then we can reinvent. Because in a real sense, we don't want to go back to normal. We want to make it better than what it was. This is exposing a lot of the weaknesses in our healthcare. This is exposing a lot of the weaknesses in our rich-poor gap, which is going to get worse in the short term. So how can we reinvent and recreate kind of social assets that can make things better when we get back, not just get them back to where they were?
So Bob, one related question from Mandy McLaughlin is, from my very simpler understanding, how is this different from setting clear goals and attaining them via trial and error? I'm concerned about wasting resources along the way. Any comments?
It's not completely different, but I think in a VUCA world, doing objective setting from the present forward is very difficult. So if you can change and alter with rapid prototyping, but it's very difficult to do present forward strategy in a VUCA world period. You really need to do future back. And I'm going to give you all the slides I'm showing today and give you access to those. We'll put them on the website. And there's more detail in the books. But I'll give you the essence of this as the follow-up to this session. But what's different about the current mood is the present is too noisy. The present is too noisy. And if you just incrementally kind of problem yourself your way to the future, it's going to be very hard. But if you go out, 10 years is about the sweet spot, and work future back, you've got a much higher potential of getting, truly transformational kind of innovation. Incremental innovation, just very tough in this period. Yeah. Although we have to put the emphasis on survival, obviously. There's so much noise out there that you need filters. And if you just ask yourself as you're listening to the briefings on the COVID crisis, who's being clear and who's being certain? And again, I'm not an expert on the present. I'm a futurist. I focus 10 years out. But it's pretty obvious to me that there's a lot more certainty than there is clarity there. You do see people who rise to the occasion. Dr. Fauci is one of those. Deborah Birx is another, who are practicing clarity but not certainty.
Okay, outstanding. And Kathy Mandato, I think he just actually answered your question, so I won't ask it. But I think it
Oh,
was.
Kathy's there. Hi, Kathy.
But let me move to one, Don Kennedy. This is a really good one. Just thoughts about industries that have lost some of their clarity, um, in the regards to the future, like retail environments.
Yeah. So I love Cincinnati, and I'm there often working with P&G people. And our latest custom forecast for them was all about the future of retail. And the phrase that we're using lately is fusion commerce, where we're moving beyond in this world, beyond either online or in store. It's really a world of both and if you think about the world 10 years ahead, it's obvious. It's obvious. We're going to have sensors everywhere. They're going to be very cheap. A lot of them will communicate with each other, and some of them will be in our bodies. It's just obvious that's where we're going to be for a lot of the world. What's not obvious then is who's going to make money from that and how's that going to work. But what it means is this notion of either online or off, that's going to look silly. And the kids are going to bring that up. So we talk about the true digital natives who are 24 or less in 2020. We're also now talking about 2020 being another threshold year. And the XR natives, the cross reality natives, those are the kids who got the Oculus Quest for a holiday gift and are growing up in a blended reality world. So 10 years from now, we'll all have the potential to be shopping all the time, essentially. Stores will still be important, but for experiences. But the experiences are going to be different in a post-outbreak world. We're going to be much more thoughtful about that. And also now, I do mostly executive groups for my talks and virtual talks. Now, half of the people I meet with have a body sensor of some kind, Apple Watch or a Fitbit or something. 10 years from now, everybody in a meeting like that will have a body sensor if they want it, and half of them will have embedded body sensors.
Yeah.
And we'll all be using them as we shop. So it's just, that's really an obvious where we're going to be 10 years from now in terms of shopping. So given that, how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? What's the clarity?
Now, Bob, the good news we're getting, we got a fantastic group of attendees. I see the 160
Great.
active attendees, which is amazing. That's what I love about the virtual world, and quite a few questions. Do you want to take another question before we go to the next section?
I love questions. I'm an interactive medium anyway, so yeah, yield to the question.
I've got a good one from someone who I consider like the architect of the Cincinnati startup ecosystem. That's my colleague, Eric Weissman. So he says, just a few years ago, the gig economy put traditional business on its ear. At the time, it seemed that gig was going to be the future. How do you see gig employees playing a role going forward?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Eric. And it's a really big deal here in California. We have this special legislation now that's requiring gig workers to be classified as employees. And it's very well intentioned, and it'll never work. And the governor even has said as much. He said, this is an attempt to humanize and to make better the life of gig economy people. But he's very open to alternatives. It's basically a prototype. We also are organizing a Future of Work Commission in California that's looking at the future of work more generally, but particularly with regard to the rich-poor gap and with regard to immigration and some of the other key topics. So inevitably, if you look 10 years ahead, we're going to have fewer traditional jobs. Inevitably, we're going to have more gig workers, not less. But also inevitably, we've got to make this work better, and it's got to be more fair for people. I think companies like Upwork have done a really good job of prototyping how gig work can be more humane, be more sustainable. They actually have ways that gig economy people can have healthcare benefits or can have retirement planning. this whole kind of post-COVID world, it means a restart for the gig economy. But the gig economy is not going to go away. But in the short run, it's going to be much more crisis-oriented because so many of the gig workers just need to survive. But long run, we got to do a better job of creating flexible work in a humane and sustainable way.
Outstanding. Okay, let me see if I can pull up. Oh, and we have one from our board member, esteemed head of NKU, Ashish Vaida, who says, anchor institutions like hospitals and university play a very specific role in regions that they serve. How does their role change in the VUCA world? Now, I know you love this question because you live it on.
Yeah, it's such a great question.
Separate webinar on this one, multi-part.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. And if we come back, I want to, on that topic, I want to be joined by my colleague, Rachel McGuire. She and I, she's leading it, are doing a project now on the future of public health. And it started before this crisis. It's for the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. And it's all about the future of public health looking out to 2035. I hope one of the positives that comes out of this crisis is that people will realize how important government is for certain things, like public health. That really does need to be done centrally. My favorite definition of government is, what do we choose to do together? And right now, in today's polarized political environment, the answer to that question has been, before the crisis, not much. Because so many people distrust government and they kind of criticize everything about government. Sure, there's lots of problems with government, but we need government. We need trustworthy government if we want to have public health. Public health is not a national issue, it's a global issue. So we need some kind of public health model. And that is the rethinking process that is underway. The challenge is the regulated side of public health is so polarized, it's hard to make any progress. Meanwhile, the commercial side of public health is unregulated and in many ways very hopeful. It's very clear to me that Apple and Google are basically healthcare companies that just happen to sell computers and connectivity. But if you look 10 years ahead, more and more, they're going to be providing health and well-being services. So I think that's a really critical question, and it has to be resolved at the policy level, public policy level, the political level, and also the commercial level. And the kind of encouraging thing about the crisis is there is quite good coordination between the public sector and the commercial sector in some of the responses that we're seeing. But the question you raise is critical.
And Bob, anything to add on university piece?
So the university piece, we did a big study that's just become public now for Southern New Hampshire University. And just this morning, I was sitting in on another webinar with Sal Khan. I think inevitably, if you look 10 years ahead, things like the Khan Academy and Southern New Hampshire University, one of the biggest online universities in the world, things like that are prototyping the way that learning is going to happen in the future. And the next decade is the moment of truth for the value of college degrees and the value of graduate degrees. And student loan debt is not sustainable. And now things like the Khan Academy and SNHU, they're showing us a better way that we can do online things that we never imagined. And now, the Khan Academy, he was just saying this morning, it's like 3x up. And they were in the millions before that, 3x up during the COVID crisis, because there's so much homeschooling and home learning. So I think those role models like Southern New Hampshire University and like the Khan Academy, they're going to be so important for reimagining what education and learning can be.
So Bob, I want to pause and let's go through a few more slides just to kind of
great.
Stir up the questions. But for those of you that have questions. Swetha, I promise we're going to get to yours, and Venkat, but just let's get back more into the slides.
Great. So here's the big question. I realized when I finished this book that I'd actually been writing a trilogy, and the trilogy focused on skills, literacies, and mindset. And I think I've got the answer here. So what I'm about to share with you is the profile for the types of leaders who will thrive in the VUCA world. And I want to break that down just quickly. We don't have time to go through this in detail, but I'm happy to come back and do this in more detail. Here are the 10 skills. And Pete, I'm going to ask you to choose one of them. I've already talked about clarity, but many of you have read this book, Leaders Make the Future. I did this right after 9/11, and then I did a second edition of it. And at the skills level, these are the 10 skills you need to thrive, but you choose one.
Yeah, it's funny, Bob. This is these skills were the anchor of my digital training at Nestle. It influenced the entire curricula. I would say, can you comment on rapid prototyping? I just wonder whether that we've always known that's a big deal, but I wonder whether that has been put on steroids at a time when all of us are interacting virtually across the world at relatively little cost. And I kind of wonder, especially, well, certainly inspiration for big companies, but especially implications for startups.
Yes, I agree. And rapid prototyping, to me, the mantra for that is fail early, fail often, fail cheaply. Fail early, fail often, fail cheaply. And even the big companies are talking about that now. It is the mentality. There's a tendency at big companies to do a small number of large experiments. What you need to do in the VUCA world is a large number of small experiments. And you need that ability. Now, right above it is immersive learning ability. That's gaming. We all have to be gamers. So if you think 10 years ahead, everybody doing innovation is going to be a gamer. And the kids are going to fuel that because they're growing up as gamers. And by gaming, I mean emotionally laden attention, the ability to simulate and learn through immersive learning with digital tools. In the gaming world, I work with EA and Electronic Arts, and I teach at EA University. If you look at the interfaces for the latest video games, they're at least 10 times better than anything we have in offices, even if we use the Mac or the Surface or the Chromebook. So that notion of rapid prototyping, I think you're right, it's going to spread, and it's just going to be a way of life. Now, the second book I did in the trilogy brought the skills together because I realized skills aren't enough. And the core literacy, this is like a discipline or a practice. The core literacy we've already introduced, and I want to end on this in a moment, is the ability to look back from the future but act now. And if you move into the upper left here, I believe my pointer will show that, voluntary fear engagement. In the military, that's called wargaming. And we all need ways to practice in low-risk ways. And, maker spaces do that really well. I was just on a call last night with Tara Brown, who is the founder of the LA Makerspace. And, she's also, by the way, one of the founders of Safecast, this big maker environment for safety monitoring that began with nuclear power, but now they're focusing on COVID. But it's taking a gamer's mentality, a maker's mentality. It's what you do at Centrifuge, and creating that ability to learn from our own fear. Because if you're not frightened by the VUCA world today, you're not paying attention. You just need to stay at the level of fear that's motivational without having it be overwhelming. I was so interesting this morning, Sal Khan and his briefing was pointing out the importance for parents doing homeschooling and using online resources. Don't beat up on yourself because all of us are tense and worried in this environment, but we need to have a healthy level of stress, and we need to take care of ourselves so we don't get an unhealthy level of stress. So then you move into the upper right, that's shape shifting. We're all creating these shape shifting organizations, and that's great in many ways. But the problem is the criminals are better at this than the rest of us. The best shapeshifters are the terrorist groups. Now, our special forces people are also really good at it, and a lot of startups are really good at it, but we all need to learn how. Being there without being there, wow, we're in a jumpstart heavy learning mode in this. And as leaders, we've got to be better when we're not there than we are when we are. We all have to be there without being there. And then finally, we all have to have energy. And we're moving from a world of time management to a world of energy management. And programs like the Corporate Athlete or the Healthiest You or the Blue Zones program, there's many different approaches to this now. But if you're not healthy, you can't lead. So that again gets back to taking care of yourself. And finally, this new mindset, and then we'll open it up. The new book that's just out this week. It just started to sell on Amazon. And I actually recorded my own audiobook this time. It was so much fun. This book pulls it all together. And what I call full spectrum thinking is the ability to see clarity across gradients of possibility while resisting the temptations of certainty. And what our brains do, I spend a lot of my time in the world of neuroscience nowadays, and that world tells us that our brains love to put new experiences in old categories. And that can get you in a lot of trouble in the VUCA world. The good news is the tools for full spectrum thinking are getting dramatically better over the next decade. Things like big data analytics, big data visualization, gameful engagement, neuroscience. We can now move beyond simplistic categories, beyond certainty, to develop our own clarity. And this is a very busy slide. I think, Pete, I'm going to leave this up while we talk a bit. These are all 10 of the skills from Leaders Make the Future, all 5 of the literacies, and the key mindset. For those of you who run companies and people in human resources, or we're working a lot with chief talent officers now. And for a number of our clients, we start from this and then help them create their own profile for the future. What's the profile of the people we should be hiring? This is it. This is it. If you find people with these skills, these literacies, and this mindset, you're going to be able to win in the VUCA world.
Okay, great. Okay, boy, more fuel for dialogue here. So we've got a feast of questions. Where do I start? All right, let me start with one of my favorite local entrepreneurs doing amazing work in HR/diversity tech, Swetha Pai. What do you think about stress tests that Jamie Dimon talked about in his annual letters? Seems like an interesting way to talk about preparing for VUCA. What does Bob Johansen have to say?
Yeah. So, well, I think that kind of stress testing is great. And you have, you can think about that as financially stress testing. I think that's what he was talking about initially. You can also think of it as stress testing from an emotional and a psychological and a social point of view. I've been working a lot with the Neuro Leadership Institute and have great respect for David Rock, the neuroscientist. And David has a wonderful model, and maybe you could put the link to this, Pete, in your notes, the SCARF model, SCARF. And what he says is, in these times of stress, we have a neuroscience reaction to that level of stress, and we have to think that through. So the S stands for status, and the F at the end stands for fairness. So our brains are expecting that we have some status, and then the C is certainty. The A is ambiguity, and the R is relatedness. And we need all of those to be working in sequence. So if you're not there physically, and we're all in a stressful world, and you're homeschooling, and it's lots of stress, our status gets challenged. we can't have the kind of relationships we used to have. So if you're a leader in that world, it's very important to be constantly encouraging people, constantly engaging. So I'm just guessing, given the fact that you're coming from a human resources point of view, you're thinking of this more from a personal stress level, but there's a whole other answer in terms of business modeling and financial stress. Both of them are important.
Okay, great. Now, Bob, no one in our region has brought what you've been talking about around gameful engagement more than Glenn Platt, a Miami professor.
Nice.
And so, I mean, he's really had this incredible impact on the region's thinking, and we're thinking about, Cincinnati being a center of gaming mechanics.
Nice.
And so one of his questions that he's posted, and I'm really flattered he's on the panel. There's something, Bob, you've brought a lot of my best friends to the table here. Failures learned by failure, rapid and repeated, but investors, despite a lot of talk about valuing failure, are still oriented around returns. How do we reconcile this?
Yeah, this is an example of the skill I call dilemma flipping. So dilemmas are problems you can't solve, problems that won't go away, but you have to figure out a way to win anyway. What you've just highlighted is a classic dilemma of the time. Now, there is a new effort in Silicon Valley here to try to develop more of a long-term stock exchange, and I hope they succeed, but that's clearly a transformational wish on my part. I hope they succeed. But in the current world, especially now, you have to figure out a way to manage the dilemma. It might be trying to institute longer-term success measures, but with the stock market falling as quickly as it has, it gets to be a real problem. And you're going to have your challenges that are coming up, and you've got Valerie talking about cash flow. Yeah. When you're worried about cash flow, it's really hard to say think long term. So that's the dilemma. Yeah. That I think we all have to face as leaders, but it's going to get worse in the short term, not better. But again, once we get through the crisis period and we get in the reset period, that may be the time to put in longer term performance measures. And that may be the time where I'm so pleased you're encouraging the use of gameful engagement in gaming. I think that work is so important. And the neat thing is the kids have a competitive advantage. So as they join the workforce, they're going to be a transformative force if we let them.
It's funny you say that, because I'm on a couple boards locally in the museum center, and for example, and I was saying, boy, as all of these groups think about the post-crisis period, their most important advisors should be like my son and his peers, that almost bring an intuitiveness to how the technology can open up experiences. And we've been thinking about should we build panels of gamers? Should we be esports Saturdays?
Definitely.
Both to kind of create a pipeline of entrepreneurs, because gamers are coders, but they're just very insight driven. There's an intuitiveness. They don't need Khan Academy. They don't need a playbook. They just get it. And we need shortcuts.
Yeah, no, I agree. And this is a historic opportunity for cross-generational mentoring. So, one of the big opportunities with homeschooling is not only for adults to teach the kids, but for the kids to teach the adults. And how can you do that better? How can we create that kind of cross-generational learning opportunity? And I think it means we have to learn, we adults and parents and grandparents, we have to learn how to be gamers.
Yeah, well, I'm going to put a call to action to this incredible cross-section of attendees. Hey, Cincinnati, let's see if we can lead the country in figuring that out, because I think we've got it in our young people. We've got so much learning across what everyone's been doing in the schools the last couple of weeks. There's probably a competitive advantage we just need to unlock. Okay, let's go through some more of these questions. Jordan Vogels from the Chamber, which has been an absolutely fantastic leader as we've worked to kind of get through this crisis. And his question is, how does being effectively caught short-footed on the manufacturing front, i.e. shortage of PPEs, change how the United States positions and readies itself going forward?
Wow. It creates a challenge, and I'm honestly not sure how we respond to the challenge. I'm much more optimistic about companies in this regard, in spite of the tension about things like market performance. I'm much more optimistic about corporations than I am about politicians. I wish I could be more optimistic about that. I work with the Army War College, as I said. We work with the CDC, with some of the health, NIH, NIMH, and some of them look 10 years ahead, maybe 15 years ahead. Last year for the Army War College, I went out in the Pacific with the Pacific Command, the Indo-PACOM region of the Army, and did a seminar with them where I participated looking at the future of China. And as best we can tell, the Chinese People's Party, for all the problems they have, their time frame is 100 to 200 years. 100 to 200 years. That's really future back. Nobody in our government is doing that. And you have to think about that if you're going to address issues like climate disruption. And in a real sense, this global pandemic is a climate disruption issue. And we don't have time to go into that, but it's not an isolated pandemic. It's a risk factor, a probabilistic event that happened that grew out of these very much larger things, which were actually quite clear in advance. But we were not prepared for them. We did not game them. We did not plan for them. So the example you give is a relatively simple one. I hope we will have learned from this, and that we'll have a more strategic approach to global health. Certainly places like Columbia Mailman School of Public Health, Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, they are great. They are wonderful programs who have this well in hand. You can see things like Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. We've got wonderful committed people who are not partisans. They work for both of the parties over the years. What we need to do is support them and do a better job. So I hope, given this lesson from this crisis, that that's going to happen.
So Bob, we're going to have to move into McLaughlin group mode, where we're going to have to maybe get some.
Okay.
So see if we can knock off as many of these questions as possible, because they're all fantastic. I feel like we could have a webinar on each one. So
I agree. Maybe Pete, can I just finish up this one last slide and then we open it up wide?
Yeah, definitely.
Good. So we're digesting. This is the last model I want to share with you, and then let's open it up. So this is the way we work in a VUCA world, and this is the model that I'm going to share with you. It was introduced in Leaders Make the Future, refined in the New Literacies, and I got it right in Full Spectrum Thinking. So this is the latest version of it, and again, I'm going to give you this slide. So nobody can predict the future. My line about this is, if somebody tells you they can predict the future, you shouldn't believe them, especially if they're from California. But you can do a lot better than nothing. The problem is our brains don't work this way. When I gave the keynote at the Neuro Leadership Summit a couple of years ago, Kevin Oxner, the neuroscientist from Columbia, was the respondent who followed me around. And when I said this, nobody can predict the future, Kevin said, yeah, Bob, you're right, but our brains try to do it anyway, every day, just to try to protect ourselves. We have this fight or flight instinct, and that's what all of us are feeling in the COVID crisis. And we got to keep ourselves at kind of level 1 anxiety and not go to level 3, which is fight or flight when the lion is chasing us. We can't live at level 3, but we have to learn from level 1. And here's how you do it. It's leaders are in the middle: foresight, insight, action. Foresight is, again, not a prediction. It's a story from the future, plausible, internally consistent, and provocative, with signals to bring the forecast to life. And, William Gibson said it best. He said, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So we have this big signals database that is at the Institute for the Future, and I think you should too. You should be sharing signals you see around you in the world every day. And the purpose of that foresight is to provoke insight. And an insight is a lot more than an idea. An insight is an aha that creates a new pattern of connections in your brain. And once you've had an insight, you can't go back. You can't unsee the insight. And it doesn't really matter if you agree with my foresight or not. It only matters if it provokes your insight. And indeed, some of the best foresight is about things that don't happen that we can avoid that provoke you to do something better. So action comes out of insight. Strategy lives between insight and action. Design lives between insight and action, leaning toward insight. Strategy leans toward action. And action is an agile way forward, expressed with clarity, and again, ideally as a story. And then you've got to integrate this with your own hindsight, which is your stories about the past, the present, and the future. And here, let me lay out a caution. I know there's a number of big co's in the room, some very innovative big co's. The challenge with innovative big companies is you have people who tried things early and they failed, and then those people got promoted. So when innovators come back to them and say, we've got this great new idea, we're sure it's going to work, or we think it's going to work, we want to try it. There's always a senior executive who says, we tried that 10 years ago and it didn't work. But it might work now.
Exactly.
So that's the challenge. How do we do that? So here's the summary, and then we'll open it up. What most organizations do, and I referred to this earlier, is present forward strategy. That does not work in the VUCA world anymore, except to do marginal incremental innovation. What we all need to learn is future back. And instead of now, next, future, we need to think about now, future, next. So for those of you who use the Horizon model, which tracks to Stanford, McKinsey, other places, Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3, it's the same thing, but you go to Horizon 3 before you do Horizon 2. You should put most of your effort on the present, Horizon 1. That's where your business is, and that's where you succeed, especially in a crisis. But instead of going Horizon 2, the kind of 3 to 5, go out to 10, and then go to incremental. So that's where I want to stop and then open it up, and I'm going to stop sharing here.
Okay, Bob, I wanted to add a comment to your, just a quote I was thinking of in my mind is almost like the future is archived. You just need to dust it off. And I've had so many conversations with my friends at P&G about, even ideas that we came up with in the early days of the interactive marketing team that were just too damn early, or the cost was prohibitively high, but the insights were spot on. And so I think part of unlocking innovation is having the courage to dust off an old idea. And
exactly.
Because I think a lot of us acted on very smart intuition in the very early days of the internet. It's just the cost structures were prohibitive. And so
exactly. And our rule of thumb when we do a 10-year forecast, which is what we're doing all the time, is look at least 50 years back. Because surprisingly, almost nothing happens that's truly new. Everybody else says, oh, it's changing so fast now. And yes, that's true in a way, but other things are not changing fast. So the challenge isn't just that things are changing fast, it's the fact that some things are changing fast, but other things are not. So it's variable speed that we're dealing with. That's why it's really important to think of the future in 60-year time swaths. And sometimes with some topics, we go even wider. We go longer into the future, we go longer into the past.
So let's try to respond to some of these in tweets and see how quickly we can get to these. So this is from Holly O'Driscoll. How might you imagine reward system changing in order to reward and recognize the new behaviors and mindsets needed when these may or may not be the behaviors and ways of working that current leaders grew up with?
Right. Right. A really good question. So if you start from the talent profile, and then within each of those areas, think about habits or metrics that you want to encourage, and kind of break that long vision down into habits. And I don't know if you've seen, I have it right on my desk here. Um, so
Bob,
this is BJ Fogg's new book, Tiny Habits. And the thing I love about BJ, he's been doing this for years. He was the first person. He's based at Stanford. He's a designer. First person to use computers to create positive benefits. Kind of to motivate people to do things positively, like body sensors for healthy living. But I think the way BJ talks about tiny habits relates directly. And then you tie your metrics to the tiny habits you want to encourage. So the key thing, start from the mindset, the literacies, and the skills, and then say, what's the long term? What's the clarity of what you're looking from long time? And then say, what are the habits you want to reward that you're betting, and betting is the word I'm using because we're not sure, that you're betting are the habits that will lead to that long-term clarity.
Okay, here's from my dear friend and colleague, Maurice Coffey, P&G EIR to Centrifuge. What advice?
Yeah.
What advice would you give current startup founders who are in the midst of having to pivot to a business model in a VUCA post-COVID-19 reality? And even those workers and entrepreneurs who find themselves being forced to enter the world of small business and startups.
Yeah.
How do they approach looking for new opportunities?
Yeah, these crisis periods are really difficult. And what you need to do is reduce the frame of reference in order to get through that period. And that's where the discipline and the tiny habits become especially important. I was running the Institute for the Future at the time of the dot-com bust. And suddenly, we used to be at the Institute for the Future, half of our clients paid early and half of them paid late. And then with the dot-com bust, everybody started paying late. And it wasn't just a little late. It was seemed like all the CFOs decided to pay, 60 days or 90 days or 120 days. And suddenly we had a cash flow crisis. So you in those kind of periods, you have to compress your frame in order to survive. And just say, and I brought in a financial person who created, we're an independent nonprofit think tank, but it was a guy who created the financial or the nonprofit equivalent of martial law. And we had to run this nonprofit think tank Futures Group like it was martial law for a few months just to survive. So I think that's the challenge that a lot of organizations face in a crisis like this. I was on a McKinsey session yesterday and seeing the curves of unemployment. And the curve of unemployment that they showed, they referred to as a wall. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was a wall. Of unemployment. So we're facing things we, in many cases, haven't faced before. And the lesson from futures work is you can't look long if you're not going to survive. So you have to make a decision: is it worth surviving? And if it is, then you have to pull in your frame. And again, I think the tiny habits model is a good way to think about it.
And that is a follow-up. Let's get a couple more in, and then I'm going to make some wrap-up comments. So a great one from Jeff DeCagna, who's really familiar with your reciprocity advantage.
Yeah.
Following provocation: our society would benefit from more stewardship and less leadership. What are your thoughts?
Right. Well, I wrote a book called Reciprocity Advantage with Carl Rahn, who many of you know, the great P&G innovator. And what Carl and I realized, and we probably wrote the book 10 years too early, but I think coming out of this, you're going to see more of a give to get strategy. And you see this playing out in the crisis. And I think what we need to look at is, what are the underutilized assets that all of us have and many of our companies have that we could give away in the faith that we could get back more in return. And then who could we partner with to do things we can't do alone? That's the essence of the reciprocity advantage. And we used it as an intentional play on words because it is a competitive advantage based on reciprocity. In the pre-VUCA world, the win-lose kind of strategy approach made more sense in a more predictable world. But in this kind of world, it makes more sense to partner, to share risk, and then partner to set up business models that you couldn't do alone. And I think Cintrifuse is really a kind of petri dish for those opportunities to happen.
Thank you. Last one from Mark Polson. And I apologize, Mark, for letting this sit for so long. But do you think design thinking mindset will take on more importance in business strategy than it is presently because of the environment?
Yeah, thank you. Yes is the answer. And I think design thinking is going to pair with futures thinking. And 10 years from now, futures thinking is going to be as popular as design thinking is now. We run a training program, you can find it on our website, to teach people how to be futurists. And we're doing these virtually right now, of course. One of those is on the link between design thinking and futures thinking. They go together really well. So futures thinking is foresight to insight. Design thinking is insight to action. So yes, and futures thinking is the way to have the biggest impact. This is, my publisher has set up a special discount code for you all. So I hope it's useful. And this is for the audiobook, the ebook, or the hard copy. And as I say, I narrated the audiobook, so hope you like it.
First off, thank you, everybody. We're absolutely thrilled with the level of attendance and the questions. And we're going to try to do a lot more with Bob. We're actually going to have a little bit of a hack about how we can come back with some interesting opportunities. But we definitely want to make sure that you get the benefit of his thinking. Here's the information about the discount code, but we're also going to, if you fill out the survey afterwards, we'll get it to you within the hour. We'll do a drawing and we'll get a bunch of you some free books. But Bob, I am so honored and flattered that you participated. I hope we can do a lot more of this, and the timing for your message couldn't be better. Also, a shout out to Catherine from my team for the heavy lifting on this webinar. This was a bit of a rapid prototyping test for us as well. So I think it went well. Actually, I'll let you guys give feedback on that. But again, hope to do a lot more. Thanks for your vision, your clarity, your passion, Bob. Love you to death.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for what you're doing.